Well, we're back again with yet another rapid fire review, and this time we're going over Tartaglia, the 5-star Hydro Bow recently introduced to Genshin Impact. Tartaglia, also known as Childe, introduces a new dual stance style of play. Set up marks on opponents in his bow stance before closing in for the kill with his melee stance, rocking dual blades as well as spear style attacks. Let's get straight to it and go over his mechanics, starting with his normal attacks. Cutting Torrent. In his bow stance, this fires off up to 6 consecutive shots. There's plenty of end lag on the final shot, so be sure to cancel this with a dash or a jump to reduce your downtime. His charged attack, like most bows, inflicts his element, Hydro, once fully charged. However, it also applies a Riptide mark, a mechanic unique to Tartaglia, for 10 seconds. At Ascension 1, the duration of Riptide extends by 8 seconds. At Ascension 4, normal and charged attack crits will apply Riptide. Hitting a marked opponent again with another charged shot will trigger Riptide Flash, which deals 3 extra hits of 12.4% AoE Hydro damage around the opponent. This effect has a cooldown of 0.7 seconds per mark. If an opponent is defeated while marked by Riptide, they'll deal 60% AoE Hydro damage around them, which also inflicts Riptide as well. The damage from these two Riptide triggers are treated as normal attack damage. Tartaglia's elemental skill is Foul Legacy Raging Tide. Activating this skill triggers a burst of AoE Hydro damage around Tartaglia and switches him into his melee stance. This melee stance deals Hydro damage with a unique 6-hit chain and a charged attack akin to a sword's charged attack. Hitting an opponent marked with Riptide triggers Riptide Slash, dealing AoE Hydro damage around them. This Riptide damage is treated as elemental skill damage. At Ascension 4, melee stance hits will also inflict Riptide. So Tartaglia's melee stance can last for up to 30 seconds unless you disable it by activating it again. The skill has an increasingly long cooldown the longer it stays active for, scaling from 6 to 36 seconds. However, if you allow the skill to time out by reaching 30 seconds, it triggers a longer cooldown of 45 seconds. Just with Tartaglia's skill, a loop starts to take shape. Set up marks on opponents before closing in with his elemental skill to trigger Riptide Slash. Against packs of enemies, multiple marks in close proximity will cause literal explosions of damage, dealing multiple instances of overlapping AoE damage. But wait, there's more. Tartaglia's elemental burst is Havoc Obliteration. In ranged stance, this becomes Flash of Havoc, dealing 378% AoE Hydro damage around an enemy, inflicting Riptide to all enemies hit, as well as refunding 20 points of the 60 energy cost. In melee stance, this becomes Light Obliteration, dealing 464% AoE Hydro damage around Tartaglia. If an opponent is marked by Riptide and is hit by Light Obliteration, it triggers Riptide Blast, dealing 120% AoE Hydro damage and removing the mark. This Riptide damage is treated as elemental burst damage. What we haven't mentioned is Tartaglia's third passive talent. It's not a domestic talent like how I usually describe the third talents. Tartaglia increases the levels of his party members' normal attack by 1. A small bump in damage, but a bump nonetheless. Alright, so we've gone over the basic kit. Let's quickly blitz through the whale bait, also known as Constellations. Constellation 1 reduces Tartaglia's skill cooldown by 20%. This is pretty simple, this increases the uptime of Tartaglia's melee stance. Constellation 2 regenerates 4 energy for Tartaglia whenever enemies are defeated while affected by Riptide. This provides Tartaglia with a form of energy generation based on the number of enemies he fights. Against larger groups, this can fuel faster bursts, but will have much less impact in fights against a smaller number of enemies, and literally no impact in single target fights. Constellation 3 is a simple 3-level increase to Foul Legacy Raging Tide by 3 to a maximum of 15. Constellation 4. When Tartaglia is in his melee stance, trigger Riptide Slash against enemies affected by Riptide every 4 seconds. If Tartaglia is in his ranged stance, trigger Riptide Flash against enemies affected by Riptide every 4 seconds. Riptide Slashes and Riptide Flashes triggered by this Constellation effect are not subjected to time intervals that would typically apply to these two Riptide effects, nor do they have any effect on these time intervals. In simple terms, this deals AoE Hydro damage to targets marked by Riptide every 4 seconds. Constellation 5 is a simple 3-level increase to Havoc Obliteration by 3 to a maximum of 15. And finally, Constellation 6. When Tartaglia uses his burst in melee stance, his skill cooldown is reset upon ending his melee stance. This improves the uptime of his melee stance by removing the issue of the extended skill cooldown resulting from letting the skill time out in melee stance. With full Constellations, Tartaglia can drag out the duration of his melee stance to its full duration without worrying about its cooldown if he uses his burst. But, well, that's full Constellations. So we'll go over Tartaglia with 0 Constellations and his passive talents. So with this sort of kit, Tartaglia sits very firmly in a main DPS role. Tartaglia doesn't really offer any damage to his team without being on the field outside of his normal attack level passive. So with his main DPS role, Tartaglia revolves around setting up marks on targets. At Ascension 4 this is fairly simple to do with a crit normal attack, fully charged aim shot, an aim shot on a weak point, or just going in with your melee attacks. Trigger these marks with fully charged aim shots or melee attacks for AoE damage, triggering extra AoE damage and marks upon defeating enemies. With so much AoE, I'd be pretty damn comfortable crowning Tartaglia the king of AoE damage. When Tartaglia is in his melee stance, he would constantly trigger Riptide Slash, as well as reapplying Riptide with his 4th Ascension. Against grouped enemies, this can be pretty lethal, with AoE stacking on each other for huge amounts of damage. The damage is slightly less pronounced against single targets, but still decent nonetheless. With its 2 forms of Elemental Burst, my gut instinct is to open fights against large numbers of grouped unmarked enemies with a ranged burst if it's available. In other situations, such as smaller numbers or enemies already marked in the middle of a fight, the burst should be held for the melee stance burst if possible, since it deals more damage against marked targets as well as triggering extra AoEs for huge numbers if targets are stacked. So Tartaglia is in a bit of a weird spot in terms of how best to build him, as well as his teammate pairings. Since his Riptide triggers in each stance are divided between normal, skill and burst damage, building any of those in particular seems to leave the rest of his damage a bit lackluster. At the very least, giving him the stringless bow and the Noblesse Oblige 2-piece set will result in big numbers for his melee burst and subsequent Riptide triggers, which is where most of his damage is concentrated. The Rust bow is a popular pick for bow characters in general and can work well as an alternative, since it also works for his melee stance. Strangely enough, even though Rust works for his melee stance, the same can't be said for the Slingshot 3-star bow. As for stat focuses, I'd prioritise attack percent, hydro damage bonuses, and crit rate. Adding more elemental mastery isn't really recommended for Tartaglia as he goes between dealing moderate hydro hits in his melee stance to lots of little hits of hydro damage in his range stance from Riptide flash triggers. This doesn't work particularly well with Vaporize as an amplifying reaction, which gets much less value from small hits. With Electro Charge, the main Electro support is Fischl, and trying to manipulate damage timings with odds to try and make the most out of elemental mastery on Tartaglia sounds pretty unfun, and also pretty bad. Delaying your attacks to try and land Hydro on an electrified enemy just means you're not attacking as often as possible, which also leads to a DPS loss. In terms of teammates, you'll want to consider supports like Bennett, Fischl, and Shangling for triggering reactions. Triggering Vaporize with big hits can double his damage or more, while Electro Charged gets decent scaling when it jumps between enemies. Overall, Tartaglia does monstrous amounts of damage during his melee stance, but his damage drops off once it's down. His damage is comparable to Diluc, but it's held back by his lack of skill uptime and his skill discouraging you from swapping to other characters. Don't let that stop you from pulling for Tartaglia though. His monumental damage peaks make up for his drops otherwise. To make the most out of him, set up the field with element enablers such as Shangling or Fischl before cutting him loose and watching him blow up his enemies. I would also consider pairing him with another main DPS to fill in the gaps while his skill is on cooldown, but if you happen to fill out his Constellations, I can see him quickly becoming a killing machine. As always, thank you very much for watching until the end. Take it easy, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next video.